I want to welcome you to the class, Federal Government 2305. I am Professor Kraus. My married name is now Green, but my records still show Kraus. And I hope that you will learn a lot from this class. I hope that these lectures will be entertaining, not as entertaining as TikTok or Instagram, but I hope that you will get something out of them. After the lecture concludes, you will answer some discussion questions. So, I know that the propensity is to like fast forward through it, but try to listen, and you can do it in chunks. You don't have to listen to the entire lecture all at once, but I hope that you will take the time to do that. The first topic I'm going to skim over is chapter 1 in your book. I didn't have you do any questions on it, but it's the groundwork and foundation of political science and what we're going to learn in this class. It is a pretty quick class. It goes for 5 weeks, and I had to eliminate some of the chapters from the book and the concepts. So I'm trying to integrate as much of that as I can into the course, and some of the things that you won't cover in the book or the lecture will be part of your discussion. But now I really want to talk to you about critical thinking and political culture. One thing that we are taught in school, or the big focus, is that Americans don't think critically. And so the whole concept of what is critical thinking, it's really foundational to understanding not just the world and the things that you learn, but to also understand government and political culture and be a responsible citizen. And how that happens is you have to be able to determine what can be believed and then make a thoughtful conclusion from that. You have to carefully evaluate the information and really read it, understand where it's coming from. Most of media, as you've probably already figured out, is slanted. There is some non-biased media, but it all has a little bit of a slant in it, unless it's just like encyclopedia, Wikipedia facts. And even Wikipedia has its issues. One of the things that is important, again, it will make you act responsibly, vote responsibly, make decisions responsibly. And you have to be willing to listen to alternative points of view and really want to know the facts. Open your mind to the opposition, the other side. One of the things that I do in my day class is I do have a lot of discussion, and we'll be doing this on the discussion boards. So it's really important that you are very respectful of other people's views, other people's opinions on things, so that you can learn and, question, rather than say, this isn't, I don't, that's a bad idea, or, I don't understand why you believe this. Ask for information. Don't call somebody an idiot because they voted for a certain party, or someone stupid because they have a certain belief about a social idea, social principle. Just think and be open. You can still keep your beliefs, but be open. So one of the things that really is an obstacle to critical thinking is, the great gift of the internet and the ability to communicate really quickly. You can FaceTime someone in anywhere in the world as long as they have access. And it is amazing what how small the world has come. But you have to really be cognizant of the source of the information. Though there's bias in it. Political leaders will make deceptive claims. Our mental habits lead us to hold false beliefs, and we engage in what's known as cognitive laziness. So, I know there's a lot of trends that happen on TikTok. That's one of my favorite sources of information to kind of pick apart. But there's a lot of information that's out there, and people will spread it and take it and run with it when there is really very little, if any, factual basis. So be very careful of that. So how does this all tie to political science? This is a political science course. I know it's called Federal Government, but political science is a very systematic study of government and politics, and analysis of the data, the ideas, and really thinking critically about why you believe what you believe, or why the actions of the government are what they are. And some of the information that you need to use, You have to get reliable information. And systemic generalizations about major tendencies in American politics. So question the man, question the ideas, question the belief systems, terms and concepts that precisely describe key aspects. You know, you may not understand what gerrymandering is or what gentrification is, or all of these buzzwords that you might hear in politics, but seek to understand, because that's going to make you a better citizen. So if you've ever traveled abroad or lived abroad, you know that the political culture of America is different from any other country. And one of the things that political culture is made up of is these very deep-seated beliefs about, you know, America is great and we have the greatest democracy and, you know, we have it all together, or we're just this corrupt mess. And again, traditions are a big part of it. We are a relatively young country, so our traditions are not as deep-seated as European nations or South American nations, or even Mexico and Canada. Canada's about the same age as we are. But again, America's core ideas are rooted in the European heritage. And when we talk about the foundations of the Constitution shortly, you'll understand that those ideas are the foundation, but we have seen a lot of change in those. So I want to talk about the core values. One of them is liberty, you know, and everyone says things about, you know, that's free speech, or I can do what I want and I have the freedom to do anything I want. Again, that is not entirely true, but how that all came about was we had unsettled land. And, you know, if you've taken a history class, you know that we had migration. You know, it started all out on the coast, and then slowly we moved in with the Louisiana Purchase, and then the great manifest destiny of the 1840s, and we reached from coast to coast. And as we went along, it's this whole freedom of being able to reinvent yourself. You can pick up and move and become something different, and the opportunities. Many people fled from Europe to escape religious persecution, and that is also one of the foundational principles in our Constitution that is often misunderstood. So, what is this whole concept of individualism? Well, it's a commitment to personal initiative and self sufficiency. So, we will talk when we talk about civil rights and civil liberties here in a week or so. But basically, it's the whole idea that we can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We are given the American dream. And in that American dream, we can take initiative and be self sufficient. And again, that all started from the beginning, the original American dream, you know, when there was the great migration after the settlement of Massachusetts. And one of the people that really saw that was Alex de Tocqueville. And again, you'll probably learn about him in your history class, but he came over from Europe and he observed that Americans are very unique in that the whole idea of individualism, reinventing yourself, moving, the transitory, the uniqueness of the United States. Definitely, we know that the Midwestern states and the characteristics there are very different from the South, and it's always been that way. And we also have had this foundational idea of equality. We'll talk later about equity versus equality when we talk about civil rights and liberties, but it's the whole idea that individuals are equal in their moral worth and that they're entitled to equal treatment under the law. And that became the 14th Amendment later in the post-Civil War era. But it was kind of perplexing in the early years. Some were free, some were enslaved. Then is a male and a female. You know, women didn't have the same rights as men, and rich people had, you know, rich landowning white men had more rights than other groups of people. And even today, we do have a differing opinion on what exactly does it mean to be equal. We want to have equal treatment under the law. We want the laws to all be applied equally, but is there true equality, or do we want true equality in America? And the last core value I'm going to talk about is self-government, and that is personal sovereignty. Again, Americans pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. They came to this wilderness of, the United States, and they built a nation. And in that process, they were very determined. And as we talk more about the Constitution and in that determination, the different states, well, then colonies, the different states, each had unique characteristics and governed themselves differently. And even within the states, there was difference in government. But the whole idea that we govern ourselves, and it's multi-layered, as we'll learn about when we talk about federalism. But the idea that we are a people that govern ourselves, being government of the people, by the people, for the people. So some of the struggles that we've had with the American ideas that we just talked about, again, equality has never been an American birthright. There has been racial immigration and restrictions. Texas is a very, very much the I guess, a good example of what happens when there's immigration and what happens to people who immigrate here. There were limited voting rights at the beginning. Even at the beginning, there was discrimination against different groups of people as the Irish came in, the Germans came in. The struggle to begin and become more equal has really been ongoing, and the civil rights movement, which is still in place today, we still have civil rights movements, and that just wasn't something that happened in the 60s and 70s. Equal treatment, we've seen a lot about the LGBTQ community, public education, higher education, access to a quality education, and how equality and self-government and liberty all play. Okay, when people hear the word politics, they think it's a dirty word. Like I often hear, don't ever talk to anybody about politics or religion, especially if you want to stay friends with them. But politics is how society settles its conflicts, and also how do we allocate the benefits of the nation and also the costs. And politics is a very big term, and there's really no universal definition of politics or political science. But basically, it's how we coexist together, live together, govern together, and who holds the power. In an authoritarian government, one openly represses its political opponents. Again, we don't have an authoritarian government, although some will say that we do. But we are on the basis of democracy, governed by the people, constitutionalism, free market, and a republic. A democracy, we are known as a democracy. It's where people govern either directly or indirectly. A pure democracy we don't have. We have a democratic republic. A pure democracy would be where there is no representation. If there's a law or anything to be put in place, the people together would decide. And so we actually elect people to do that for us. In practice, it's come to mean majority rule, because we have free and open elections of representation. So whoever is the majority votes for a candidate, and that candidate gets put in place. So even if you're a Democrat, a Republican may represent you. Majoritarianism is that the majority effectively determines what the government does. So, Texas is often seen as a Republican state, even though the major cities, with the exclusion of Fort Worth, vote Democratic in the presidential elections. But the majoritarianism, we do have Democrats in our state legislature. We have Democratic representatives that go to Washington for us, but the majority is Republican. Okay, within the democratic system, there's the idea of pluralism. The preferences of special interests largely determine what the government does. So there are groups in their special interest groups, but it's not just special interest groups that are formal, but it's us as a collective that decide what the government does. And how we do that is we elect people, and we also make our voices known. And the authority is who we recognize that exercises that power. And in contrast, we don't have an authoritarian government, and that way they would repress us and make sure that through fear, intimidation, restriction of our rights, and even imprisonment and physical abuse still happens around the world, as we've heard and we've learned about. But we do have a democratic society. For good or for bad, we do have the ability to govern ourselves. In the constitutional form of government, we have an elaborate system of checks and balances, and we'll talk about what those are and how they work and why we have them. Also, a Bill of Rights was added before it was ratified, and those are the first 10 amendments. Constitutionalism is the idea that there are restrictions on government's power. So they're not all powerful. There's restraints on what they can and cannot do. And we as citizens can take legal action if we believe that the government is infringing on our rights. And so it's important to know the Constitution, to know the amendments, to understand exactly what the government can and can't do and what each branch can and cannot do. When we talk about the economic system within the United States, it's described as a free market system, and it operates mainly on the interaction of buyers and sellers, and they call it private transactions. There are some government interventions. We're not a pure market society, as you know. There's regulations and taxations and spending policies. So we're not purely a free market. There is government intervention. And through time, that government intervention has increased. And if you're a student of history and you've learned about history, that the government really came in and took hold at the turn of the 20th century, the early 1900s, during the progressive era. A lot of regulations came upon. And even through all of that, and a lot of it was to suppress corporate power, which we know still exists, that business have a big say in public policy. And the whole idea that there's just a small group of well-connected, well-positioned, wealthy people that have influence on our government. So just to kind of recap, we have a democratic, constitutional, free market system in theory, and how that works and the strength of each of those changes through time. The big foundation of American democracy and our power is that we don't have just, even though we hear about the presidential election, it's the big news. We have so many different layers of government, from elected to appointed to hired, that the sharing of power is so widespread, and it's not just concentrated in one area. And there are very few nations that have as many competing interests in institutions as we do. We have what some call a bloated bureaucracy, meaning that we have so many agencies that cover so many aspects of our life. And those institutions also are extensions of the branches of government, and they interact with them, the laws that are made that are then put in place through the federal government, as far as like different agencies. And then we have the courts that come in and make sure that everything is constitutional. And then we also use the courts as well to make sure that our rights are not overrun or suppressed, as well as between the states and the individuals. So it's a very complex web. So here's some critical thinking questions I want you to think about, and these will be part of what you'll do in your discussion board. Kind of talk about the difference between general political power and authority, which is a special kind. Contrast the American political culture with that as most of other Western democracies, and what is in the American experience that led people to derive their national identity from a set of shared political ideals. And what are the defining features of America's major systems of government: democracy, constitutionalism, free market? So we've talked about the Constitution and exactly what it is, and how it governs us, and what it is, the ruling document over our democracy and the different branches of government. But before the Constitution, like how did that come about? It wasn't just, a bunch of people sat around and said, let's write this document and let's try to govern ourselves. This was a very long time in coming, very complex. system that started even from the beginning when we first landed on the continent, or the people who were here interacting with the people who were already here. But the Constitution really took place after the French and Indian War. And if you learned about that in your history class, the French and Indian War was a war not with the French against the Indians. It was the British and the colonists against the French and the Indians about the expansion and territory and access to natural resources, and a lot of complexity there. But after that was over, that was part of the 7 Years' War that Great Britain was fighting in other places too, and it was very costly. And so Parliament said, that we came over there, we protected the colonists, so they're going to kind of pay us back. And so I always equate this to the idea that, at the beginning, we were, as colonists, we were very free to govern ourselves, to live, to develop our own culture. Kind of like, when you go away to college, you're going to get your new identity. You don't, and if you go away to college, your parents aren't going to show up at your door and, hopefully, in the middle of the week and make sure you're studying, or, they'll probably call you, check on you. But then after a while, they start coming more frequently and more frequently. And then before you know it, they're there all the time. And they're asking you to pay them back for everything you've done for them. So as time goes on, there's this, what they call salutary neglect at first, where the colonies are ruling themselves, developing their own economic systems, their own governing, with some intervention with Great Britain. And it wasn't totally hands off, but now they're coming in and asking for taxes. And the taxes that they're asking for there's no representation in Parliament. So there's no colonists that go over and help decide what those taxes are and where they are. So it was really taken aback. So the First Continental Congress met in 1774, not to separate, but to try to get redress on their grievances. And before the Constitution, again, the traditions of limited government and representative government had already been there. Limited government is one where there are strict legal limits on the uses of power. Representative, again, is where people govern and they elect people or select people to speak for them, to make decisions for them. And the Americans' British heritage also laid the foundation of that. The colonial had experience with English Parliament, and the colonial charters themselves some of them were actually used as frameworks for the documents that we wrote in the early years. And like the Rights of Englishmen gave us the idea of trial by jury. So it wasn't just, they didn't just come out of nowhere and have those ideas. They actually drew those from British ideas. So we started out during the war, and there's a lot more to this, and I'm not going to get into the big detail, but basically there was a document called the Articles of Confederation where the 13 colonies all came together because they realized during the American Revolution, now they're trying to repel Great Britain, they needed to have some sort of governing document and some sort of cohesion with each other to fight a war. And it really wasn't a constitution, it was more like a guidebook. I kind of look at it as like, the student handbook. It wasn't a constitution, it was just a guidebook of how government would operate. And it really created a very weak national government. There were representatives from each of the colonies, and there was someone that kind of presided over it, but there was no president, there was no court system. And so really during that time before the Constitution, they weren't really a nation. There were 13 different nations all kind of coming together like what we have today with the United Nations, trying to make guidelines for how to conduct themselves. And so eventually the weaknesses of the national government was raised in Shays' Rebellion, Daniel Shays' Rebellion. And if you learned about that in history class, after the American Revolution, there was a lot of debt. War is not cheap. And the farmers in Massachusetts had an uprising because they weren't able to pay for their mortgages and they were having their homes taken away and their livelihood and their farms taken away. And they sprung up into a rebellion. They kind of formed together and said, we're not going to take this. And it was kind of spirited from the American Revolution that had just ended. And so during Shays' Rebellion, they realized that Congress couldn't raise an army, and they could ask the different colonies to send people, but they couldn't really raise an army because there was no document that commanded them to do that. Secondly, there was no document that said they had to pay taxes or they had to pay the war debt. It was more of a voluntary thing. When small states like Rhode Island, who suffered financially, didn't really have the money to contribute towards the debt. More wealthy states like Virginia were able to. So they came together not with the idea that they were going to write a whole new document and scrap it. They came together because they wanted to rewrite the Articles of Confederation. And one of the interesting pieces in that is that it took unanimous consent for anything to be changed. And I always bring this up if there's a room full of people and you say, hey, let's order pizza. And, some people are going to be like, yeah, no, I don't like pizza. And then you say, okay, we're going to get it. What do you want on it? And so some people are going to want pepperoni. Some are going to want, the dreaded pineapple and ham. But eventually you're going to realize that if we can't make a simple decision about what we're going to get on our pizza, how are we going to all come together with 13 unique identities and interests? We've got the South with slavery and the cotton culture, and then we have the North with the merchants and the shipping, and then the more middle, like Pennsylvania, that had the farm country. So they were unique identities, and so how are they going to all come together and agree on anything? So nothing would be done. Nothing could get done. So eventually they realized this, scrapping this document was the only way. So eventually they had a constitutional convention in Philadelphia. The delegates ignored the instructions of Congress. They didn't go and rewrite the articles. Instead, they drafted a brand new form of government. And so they decided that government must be granted the power that's necessary to carry out its responsibilities, like to tax in order to pay debt, to form a military in order to defend ourselves. And we're a brand new nation and very weak and vulnerable. So there was no telling if another nation would come in and take us over when we weren't really well organized. It would also give us the ability to make treaties with other nations. And also, one big thing is to coin money, because the money systems back then were by the colonies, and nobody really knew what the value of the currency in Pennsylvania was when it came against like Rhode Island. So trade was really difficult, and there was just they were a nation that was coming together, but they really didn't have a firm grip, and they weren't really working together as a team. They still were working as individuals. So they did have to make some early compromises. One was on the Virginia plan and New Jersey plan, and then that ended up with the Great Compromise. Virginia was one of the larger states, and initially, when under the Articles, every state had a representative. And so Virginia, of course, said, well, that's not really fair because we're a lot bigger than the rest of them. So why do we only get one? And little bitty New Jersey, also gets one. We have bigger interests. So then New Jersey said, wait a minute, that's not fair, because if we do it by population, then the country's going to be run by the larger states. And so they compromised, and that's how we have a bicameral Congress. We have the House of Representatives, which is based on population, and we have the Senate, and we have 2 senators from every state. So that was one of the big compromises that they had to make early on. Another one was the Three-Fifths Compromise and the issue of slave trade and slavery. They decided not to tax exports, so not tax things that left the country, only things that came in, to protect American industry. And after 1808, there was no more slave trade. So people misunderstand that they outlawed slavery. They just said no more slave trade, so no more slave ships coming in from other countries bringing slaves in. So slavery was able to exist, but in order to get new slaves, it had to be through population growth. And so then again, when the southern states, and we'll look at a graph here in a minute, they came together and they said, well, wait, when we talk about population, a large majority of our population is slaves. And so are we going to count them? And people in the North said, no, that's not fair because slaves under the law and under this new nation are not citizens. So why should we count them? So they came up with a three-fifths compromise that said that slaves could be counted as three-fifths of a person for tax apportionment. So when the government gave money, or to pay, or the states had to pay money, and also, most importantly, for political representation. So if you look at this graph, you can see states like South Carolina, where almost half of their population in 1790 was slaves, and Virginia at 40%, then Georgia, North Carolina, Delaware, and then we've got New Hampshire, which less than 1% were compromised of slaves. And there wasn't the need for slaves in the northern states because in the South they had more labor intensive crops that required the manpower. And, there is something to say that the more northern states, if you know anything about history, were formed more a lot for religious purposes, and there was some entrenchment of religion. And so that was part of the protest against slaves. But the big thing is, what was the purpose, the economic purpose of slavery? And so one of the ideas they also had to come up with is, we don't want a king. So we don't want another oppressive monarch. So what are we going to do? And they agreed the powers of the presidency, but they really differed on the structure and how he would be picked. People like Alexander Hamilton said, let's have three. There'll always be a tiebreaker, so let's have three people in charge. And or we can have, more than that, or two or three. But then they said no, that would not, nothing would get done if we have three. And so after 60 votes, they had to vote over and over and over and over and over again. It isn't 60 people voting, it's voting 60 times. They finally decided on votes by electors, which is later known as the Electoral College, and each state has the same number of votes as the members in Congress. So if you take the House of number of people in the House plus the 2 senators of every state, that's how many votes that they would have to vote for president. So when we go to the polls and vote for president, we are not voting directly for the president. We are voting for these electors that vote for us. And most states, I think almost every state, I think there's only one that would allow the electors to change their vote when it came to actually casting it. But the electors have to vote the way that the state voted. So that's also become a big controversy because each state goes to one candidate rather than being able to split the votes up. And there's never been a really viable system to overthrow that, to be able to stop that. It's been a tradition since the beginning. It's one of those institutions and those things that we do that maybe doesn't have practical purposes anymore, because at the time they did it, remember, they had 13 states and now we have 50. So it's a lot different. But the idea that there would be just one president. And so they had to get together and they had to go through a ratification process. Basically, that's, signing on the dotted line and saying this is the new Constitution. And then they had to send it to the states, and they had at least 9 of them had to approve it. And there was some holdouts, New York being one of them. And what their big beef was they felt like the Constitution didn't protect their rights enough. And the people in the Federalist who were for it said, well, it doesn't say that Congress can do this, or it doesn't say that the president can do that. So what makes you think they're going to do that? So what makes you think that they're going to take away your freedom of speech, freedom of press? What makes you think that they're going to take away your the right for legal seizure and search? Why don't we leave those things up to the states? And the federal government would be one that would just kind of be an umbrella over the states and kind of control, as James Madison called them, factions. So no one group or state could like uprise and take over. The strong federal government could control that and make sure that everybody's interests are met. So they debated the anti-federalists. They said that that today we still talk about it. I mean, the anti-federalist sentiment was the springboard for the Civil War. They would fear that the national government would be too powerful, that state self-government and personal liberty would be placed at risk. And then the Federalist Papers, written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, they really did a really good job of persuading, and the compromise was that they would have a Bill of Rights. And those are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. They protect things like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, trial by jury, the right to remain silent, illegal search and seizure. It talks about the rights of the states. It limits the power of the federal government and gives the states power. If you've read the first 10 amendments, the right to bear arms, those were all things that were very pertinent at the time that the Constitution was written, and they were afraid. And so the framers really wanted a national government that could act decisively but not be irresponsible. They really didn't trust unrestricted majority rule. And so they wanted to have a very broad federal government. Individuals can act and think as they choose, as long as they don't infringe on other people's freedom and well-being. And so the goals of the framers were strong government enough to meet the needs, like in defense and trade, that they wouldn't threaten the existence of the separate states. Those states are going to be there. They're not going to be taken away. Their power is not going to be taken away. That the government would censor itself, that would limit itself, and that people would have a voice in the representative government. And so, again, they wanted enough so that the nation's needs were being met. And again, those are the primary ideas. So how they did that was through grants of power. There are certain things the national government can do, like coining money, defense, signing treaties, and then those other things that are not specifically granted to the federal government are left to the states. However, unless it specifically says you cannot do that, there is something known as the elastic clause in there that says that the federal government has the right to make laws in order to execute the Constitution. So that elastic clause has been used quite frequently, and it's really changed how our government is. And again, also, they made the Constitution really difficult to amend. So if you think about it, it was ratified 1781. And here we are in 2024, and we only have 27 amendments. And so two of the big cornerstones of it are checks and balances and separation of powers. So we know that the legislative writes laws, the executive executes the laws, and the judicial branch looks and makes sure that it's constitutional. So they judge the laws. And Montesquieu, who was one of the foregoing political philosophers of the time, said that it would be easier if you break it up into those three branches. And then Federalist number 10 worried about overbearing majorities, so there are checks and balances, and I'm sure you maybe have learned about them, things that, and any action by one of the branches is checked by the other. So again, grants of power are powers that are granted to the national government. Powers not granted it are or denied it unless necessary and proper to carry out granted powers. Denials, these are things that specifically say they cannot do. And separation of powers is, again, that there's power sharing with three branches and each one of them checks the other. Again, there are shared legislative powers, like Congress is checked by the president and the Supreme Court. So if Congress makes a law and how does the president, while he can veto it, it can be overridden, but also any law that even gets signed by the president can be checked by the Supreme Court. And we have had laws that have been overturned because of that. And shared executive powers, the president checks Congress, and judicial, they check everything. So the president is checked by both branches. The court system is checked by both branches because, first of all, to become a judge, a federal judge, you're appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And there have been some that have been removed, not federal judges, although right now there is currently one, Samuel Alito, that people are questioning because he flew a flag upside down in support of the January 6th riots. And apparently he had another flag that aligned with some of the people who supported Trump. And the Supreme Court is supposed to be party-free. We know that they are party related because they have allegiance to the person that put them in that position, but they're supposed to be neutral. And again, they share power. So Congress can impeach the president, which we've learned about impeachment, and they can override a presidential veto. They can investigate the president. A lot of this stuff is, pretty pertinent now. Any treaty that gets written has to be ratified by Congress. Any executive appointments, so the different, like Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Housing, judicial appointments, they enact the budget and laws, which the president's actions occurs. Again, Congress is over the Supreme Court. They can also decide the size of the court. They can impeach and remove judges. They can rewrite legislation that the courts have interpreted and make constitutional amendments. And so there's a lot of different interaction between the three, and that was to make sure that not any one branch had too much power. And the framers wanted to make sure that there was not going to be tyranny of the majority, people acting on their own. And again, they believe people deserved a voice. And a democracy versus a republic, a democracy to the framers, a government in which the majority has absolute power, but they preferred the idea of a republic where there's limits on the power of the government, where people have rights guaranteed by a constitution and protected through carefully designed institutions. And again, limited power. We've talked a lot about this. Senators were appointed by the legislature of their states back then, and then eventually senators became elected, and that was in the early 1900s in a constitutional amendment. And so there's limited popular rule. They didn't let them appoint everything. Like in the state of Texas, judges are elected, but at the federal level, they are appointed. So again, the president every 4 years, we have one coming up. Senators are for 6 years, U.S. representative 2 years, and then federal judges serve for a life as long as they behave. And to alter the Constitution, again, the whole idea that government belongs to all, not just the elite. They wanted more power to the people. Early 1800s, a Jacksonian democracy urged states to let people vote, to award electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote. And another thing that happened in Jacksonian democracy back then, it was known as the time of the common man, I'm sure you've learned about. And initially, the nation was basically run by wealthy white landowners. So they were the ones that voted, they were the ones that were in office. And then during the Jacksonian period, the early 1800s, people got to vote that were not landowners. And then slowly in certain places, women got to vote. And of course, women didn't get the right to vote completely until just a little over 100 years ago. And again, you can see on this map how different we all are. And it's, you can look at the geography. The red ones are the states that voted for Trump and the last election. The light blue are the ones that voted for Biden. And then there are 2 states that allowed split votes, and they had split votes. So you can see kind of geographically the clusters where the Republican votes are, where the Democrat and where the split votes are. And today we do have a constitutional democratic republic. Today's model is more representative. We have more frequent elections than any other democracy. As soon as someone is elected to the House of Representatives, they have 2 years and they're going to get reelected. And so these are some of the ideas that you might be asked about. Define the concept of judicial review. How does the court decision involving judicial review differ from an ordinary court decision? Contrast the original system for electing federal officials with the system today. Like originally, the election of federal officials was done by rich white landowners, and today there are some restrictions on voting, but generally anybody who is 18 years old, a U.S. citizen, can vote, as long as in most states you can't have a felony. But most of the interesting that we do have a presidential nominee. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that President Trump cannot run, even though he's been convicted of several felonies. And why is it more accurate to say that we are a system of separated institutions sharing power rather than shared powers? Talk about checks and balances. And one of the big concepts here is federalism, and the whole idea that federalism is the splitting between the national and the state. And we have a unitary system where the national government is sovereign, or a confederacy. That's what we had early on. The states are sovereign, but we have what's called federalism. So the state and the states, the local government, and the national government all share power. So an argument for federalism. There's problems with too weak of a national government. If we don't have a strong, we can have political disorder, economic chaos, inadequate defense. Federalism was a huge topic during COVID because states were deciding when to close down. States were deciding, even though they were given the vaccines, how they would get the vaccines out there. And there was such a wide variation with guidance from the federal government. And if you know anything about Hurricane Katrina in 2006, there was a lot of difficulty in being able to handle a national disaster because there was not clearly defined roles about who was supposed to do what. And the new federal system divides power among 2, national and state. And again, that's to protect liberty and also moderate the power of government, because who knows better how Texans should run Texas than Texans? Who knows better how to run Ohio than Ohioans or New Yorkers in New York? So there are enumerated or express powers that we talked about earlier. These are ones that are granted to the national government. There are 17 powers. And if you read the Constitution, there are 17 specific powers that are given directly to the national government. Things like, to help secure our defense, stable economy. But then there's also the supremacy clause, that national laws are the supreme law of the land. So if Texas makes a law and then the federal government makes a law and they're contradictory of each other, then the federal law is supreme. Then there's something called implied powers. These are not actually written down in a list. And again, like I said, these are necessary and proper. These are the power to make laws to support any of the expressed powers. So, for example, during the Great Depression, there were laws that were written that weren't specifically granted by the federal government, but the federal government used this elastic clause that says, we've got to get this nation up and running again. And also during times of war, there have been some, like during 9/11, during COVID, there are laws that are being put in place, and the federal government is coming in, and the states are kind of rebelling that, saying, whose right is it? Is it a state's right or is it a federal government right? Most recently, the idea of same-sex marriage, states originally had the right to do that. That is actually something that is granted to them, but the Supreme Court ruled that the idea of not allowing people of the same sex to marry was violating the Constitution. And even more recently than that was the overturning of Roe versus Wade. That's when the federal government comes in and allows the states to do things that they couldn't do before. Before, it was a protected right, the right to privacy. And then the Supreme Court came in, reinterpreted the Constitution, and now the states have more power back on them. And there are a lot of circumstances like that. There are the reserve power. The 10th Amendment says the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved for the states. So things like, when you can get married, things like divorce, there's a lot of the schooling systems, like even though there's nothing in the Constitution that says you have to go to school. But there are federal guidelines that are used under the Elastic Clause, but they also allow the states to administer education the way that they wish. One of the big controversies right now in Texas is the idea of immigration. Immigration is a federal matter, but the states believe that the federal government is not handling it correctly, and they're kind of coming in under this 10th Amendment and saying, you're not doing anything to secure our borders. But the whole idea of nationalization, the general shift in power from the states to the national government is taking place. So who becomes a citizen and who doesn't is a federal matter, but it doesn't specifically address the idea of immigration. So some of the shared powers that we have are like lending and borrowing money, taxation, law enforcement, banks, transportation. And then the things that are federal, national defense, currency, we can't make Texas money. The post office, now the post office is partially private. Foreign affairs, and we can't make a treaty with another country. We couldn't make a treaty with Mexico, or we couldn't make a treaty with Canada separately. That's got to be a federal. And then interstate commerce, it's commerce that goes between the states. And that commerce has really been broadened with the internet. Then things that are just left to the states are chartering local governments, education, public safety, registration and voting. A lot of people don't know that. How we register and how we administer votes is a state run with federal oversight. And then intrastate commerce. So they don't have any say in what we do within our state. It's only when it goes across the state lines. And it can, the internet is one way that happens. There are a lot of ambiguities in the Constitution. Again, interstate versus intrastate. And, when the internet first came about, there was a big controversy about sales tax, like who collects sales tax. That was eventually resolved. If you are in a state where that company that you bought the internet product from has a subsidiary or an office, then you have to pay sales tax. But at the beginning, nobody was paying sales tax. And then, so as time goes on, we have to keep reshaping and reforming exactly what that looks like, and what's the difference between intra and inter, and how we administer the states versus the federal. And dual federalism is when there is a really deep separation, like this is definitely something only the federal government does, and this is something only the states do. And that was post Civil War up until 1937, which was towards the end of the Depression, right into World War I. The 14th Amendment was intended to protect the newly freed slaves, but over time it was interpreted to give states discretion. And so the separate but equal, and then the whole idea of the 14th Amendment has been used more in any other Supreme Court case than any other piece of the Constitution about equal protection of the law, under the law. And the right to privacy was part of the 14th Amendment. And again, after the Civil War, the Supreme Court nearly gave free rein to business. And then they came in to regulate Congress. And then, this is a lot of historical stuff, the New Deal, social programs. We no longer really have dual federalism. There's not any exact layer anymore. We have something more called devolution, where we pass the authority back to the state and local government in selected areas. So the federal government shares power with the state governments in what's known as like a marble cake, which is cooperative, where we share responsibilities, where we work together. The federal government will give us money and then we use it how we wish. A good example of that is healthcare. There is a national marketplace that everyone has access to if you don't have healthcare, but the state and other states, they also supplement it. Texas does not. We're the most underinsured state in the United States. But again, there are different things. There's joint funding, administration, how we do things. The federal government has a big oversight like education, but the states get to decide exactly what that looks like. Fiscal federalism is federal funds that are used for state and local programs. There's a lot of fiscal federalism that goes on, and COVID was a good example of that. There was money passed down from the federal government to the local. So if you were, going to be evicted or you needed money because you weren't working, unemployment, that's the federal government gives it to the states. The states decide how to use it. And then we have cash payments. Categorical grants are restricted to certain state programs. So they give us this money and say, here, you can only use this on roads. You can only use this on education. Well, the school systems here do get a lot of federal funding. Block grants are for state programs that address a concern. They're less frequent, so block grants might be something like, again, that has to do with COVID or disaster relief. Again, there's a more shift of power to the state and local government. It's more strongly held by Republicans than Democrats, and it dramatically increased after Republicans really took over in 1994. And one of the most sweeping changes was the Welfare Reform Act of 1996, and more people were pushed to go off from the welfare rolls. The movement kind of waned after 9/11. The federal government tightened up a little bit more. The federal government tightened up a little bit more when it had to do with affordable care and with like COVID. And there has been some shift. The election of Biden in 2020 continued the tug of war between Republicans and Democrats. Should this be a state right? Should this be a federal government right? I'm going to skip through that. So here, distinguished among federal system, unitary, and confederacy, what circumstances led the framers of the Constitution to create a federal system? So why do you think we have a federal system? What are the pros, cons, benefits? Dual federalism and cooperative federalism. Again, dual federalism is where the federal government and the states have a very clear line. They don't work together. The federal government specifically does this. The states specifically do that. And ironically, even in national defense, we do have cooperative federalism because we have like the Texas National Guard. The Texas National Guard actually is part of the federal military. And like a layer cake is how they call the dual federalism. Like if you've seen a layer cake, there's like chocolate, vanilla. So it's very distinct. You know, when you bite into it, it's going to be chocolate. If you go down here, it's vanilla. Or a marble cake, if you know what that is kind of like all together. It's kind of like a swirl. Like if you go get a swirl and it's all over. Or like if you go to Dairy Queen and get one of their shakes, and everything's all in there. So everything is all together and everything's working together. So the federal and the state work together. And how have the federal government's superior taxing policy and economic interdependence of the American states contributed over time to a larger policy role for the national government? What role have federal governments in grants and aid played in the expansion of federal government authority? So those are just some things for you